Welcome back to Taiwan Talk. I'm Dennis Wang, and today we have a truly special guest with us, Eugene Chaosovsky. Eugene is a Senior Director for Analytical Development and Training at New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C., who is a leading voice on geopolitics and global energy strategy. Today, we are going to dive into how Taiwan can strengthen its energy security from nuclear energy revival to LNG import strategies, all set against the backdrop of growing geopolitical tensions. Eugene, welcome.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, nuclear energy, it brings opportunity and strategic positioning questions for us. So, Eugene, looking at Ukraine's experience, nuclear energy played a crucial role in sustaining the country's energy grid, even during wartime disruption. How could Taiwan similarly benefit from reinvesting in nuclear power as part of its energy security strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Dennis, Ukraine, even in times of war, which we've seen a lot of disruption, not only militarily, but also, the attacks against civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. Part of what has, enabled Ukraine to basically continue to, push through is that it has multiple sources of energy, including what you mentioned on nuclear energy. So Ukraine has been traditionally reliant on external sources for energy, in particular Russia, when you're looking at things like natural gas or oil, which go through pipelines, some of which have been attacked, some of which have been cut off even before the war started. So Ukraine's own domestic supply of nuclear energy has been one of its saving graces, if you will, even and especially during times of war. This is an energy source that Russia is less inclined to attack, given the potential implications of that. So even when you have an active military conflict, these are somewhat counterintuitively some of the more safer assets that a country can have within its energy grid. And so I think this is something that a lesson that can be taken for Taiwan. Obviously, the concerns over nuclear energy are very much understood, but at the same time, I think having access to multiple sources of energy, nuclear, whether that's during normal peacetime or especially during a conflict, I think is something very important for Taiwan to consider.
Yes, well, the reason why we start with the Ukraine and Taiwan comparison is because this is a very unique geopolitical pressure on Taiwan. People know Taiwan is facing the great threat from China. And as we know, Taiwan faced unique geopolitical pressure, especially from the rising tension in the Indo-Pacific, as we just mentioned. So, Eugene, how important is a resilient domestic energy system, including nuclear, to Taiwan's overall strategic defense posture?
I think it's critical for Taiwan, in particular because Taiwan, as an island that's mostly dependent on imports for its energy, whether it's natural gas, whether it's coal. These are things that we've seen, energy supplies, can be subject to disruption, whether due to manipulation over geopolitical issues or even, non-geopolitical issues, but things like weather and other things. So I think for Taiwan, it's really important to have a diversified mix of energy supplies, including those and especially those that can be produced domestically. So nuclear, obviously plays a very key role in that regard. It doesn't mean that you have to be overwhelmingly reliant on that particular source, but it does help to have options, right? Especially if you're going to have some of your other sources of energy potentially subject to some kind of disruption. And by the way, just because of more increased energy demand to power things like AI usage, Taiwan's advanced manufacturing sector, even without these kind of geopolitical disruptions, you will need more and more and reliable sources of energy, which again, whether it's natural gas, whether it's renewable sources like solar and wind, and especially sources like nuclear, I think all of those are important for Taiwan moving forward.
Yes, well, Eugene just mentioned Taiwan need to have like diverse resources for energy. But when we talk about diversity, given Taiwan as a country, we also have to consider most of the energy supply is actually imported to Taiwan. So when we talk about import, export, trade is a key point, right? It's a key player, key feature. So trade and tariff tension with the U.S. today have impacted several sectors. If Taiwan pushed for greater energy independence through nuclear and LNG, how can it navigate trade negotiation or avoid becoming overly vulnerable to shifting U.S. energy or technology tariffs?
Yeah, I think that those things are not mutually exclusive. Right now, obviously, there is a lot of turbulence on the trade front. Although the negotiations between Taiwan and the U.S. are ongoing and in a very active phase in this 90-day sort of pause period. And actually, one of the elements that Taiwan has raised, rightfully so, in my opinion, is the potential to increase energy imports from the US, in particular LNG or liquefied natural gas. That has dual benefits. One, which is that can enable Taiwan to diversify its own supplies. I mean, if you're looking at where Taiwan currently gets its LNG from, that includes from some very friendly countries like Australia, for example, but also some, let's say not unfriendly, but less allied countries such as Russia or Qatar. So to have the U.S. LNG pick up some of that slack, I think is not a bad thing for Taiwan. In fact, I think that will help. And on the other hand, that will also be a good incentive in order to reduce some of those tariffs that the U.S. has floated over trade, in general. So it's not about diversifying just to the U.S. and having no other options. It's making sure that you have a good, sort of balanced mix from a number of different countries. But I think it makes sense to have your main energy suppliers, those that you are aligned with, especially in a potential crisis scenario, versus those countries that you're not sure how they're going to react. I mean, Russia in particular, we've seen has allied with China on a lot of different issues. So being dependent on Russia for energy supplies, I think there's certainly the case to be made to lower, if not necessarily eliminate, but certainly to lower those dependencies.
Yes, well, indeed. Well, we certainly hope the U.S. will lower tariff on Taiwan. When we talk about trade, another issue is also quite important, which is, how Taiwan can get those import energy, right? Especially Taiwan, as we mentioned, Taiwan is an island country. So Taiwan, any energy imports must pass through contested waterway, like the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait. When planning a nuclear expansion or boosting LNG imports, what role should strategic partnership, say, with Japan, Australia, or the U.S., play in safeguarding these vital supply routes?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where the energy sector very much intersects with security and national security issues. And so it's important to have contingency plans in place, especially with what you mentioned, potential disruptions, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea. Having alternative sources, or being able to plan with countries from everything from a minor disruption to a blockade scenario, right? So this is where the planning for economic and energy issues has to go hand with security issues. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happen in terms of military joint exercises that happen, coordination between not only the US and Taiwan, but as you mentioned, Japan, Australia, the Quad. There's a lot of different contexts here in which we can see potential changes and potential disruptions. So that kind of whole of government approach and the strategic planning is very important. And that kind of ties into the trade issues as well. If you've noticed, the US has linked some of its trade negotiations with even security issues, right? So being able to acknowledge that and to be able to play into that to enhance Taiwan's not only energy security, but overall national security, I think is very important.
Yeah, we know like Taiwan is heavily relied on import natural gas, but its LNG, the liquefied natural gas import capacity is nearing its ceiling. What are the major risks Taiwan face if it cannot secure enough new LNG supplies or cannot have like more storage for LNG supply amid this growing regional competition? And I'd like to also ask, what's your take on both from the government front and the private sector front? How should they, prepare for this, the limit?
Mhm. Well, I think that the major risk here is that whether you're talking about a shortage in terms of a disruption, or again, just because of that major increased demand, I think the projections are, energy demand growing 300% just for the kind of the most advanced semiconductors, for example. So there
Yes.
is going to need more and more energy in order to supply that, which I know Taiwan is a leading global power. So the risk is one that's very much economic in nature, meaning that you will not be able to fulfill your growth potential or even the current existing lines of production as long as your energy capacities are not sufficient to do that. And that's not just for right now, but especially kind of projecting 5 to 10 years down the line. So this is where it's important to examine really all avenues, whether that's existing or expanding LNG infrastructure, whether that's expanding renewable energy capacity, and restarting or re-examining the nuclear infrastructure, because this is an advantage that Taiwan has, that it already has those capabilities, but for various different reasons, those capabilities are not kind of met in terms of their potential, right? So these are the kinds of things that the kind of risks, and whether you're a government or whether you're a business, I think it's very important to be able to understand not only the current trends, but also what we could see happening in the future, whether it's as a result of trade disputes or whether it's as a result of some security disruptions. These are scenarios that's very important to plan for, so that you're not caught, by surprise, and you already have a plan in place from a best case scenario to worst case scenario and everything in between.
Yeah, well, I'd like to just follow up a little bit more, like for private sector specifically. We know the private sector need to be aware of this situation. We know the private sector maybe need, have to learn more about the situation. So how do they, well, what's your suggestion for private sector, like a business owner? Do they just read more news? Or they follow any guideline? If they like to follow any guideline, where can they find those information? Any suggestion for private sector specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, it's important to stay on top of the news, everything from global sources to local and regional sources. But for example, New Lines Institute, which is, the think tank that I work for, we actually do forward-looking forecasting reports, as well as interactive crisis simulations that actually put you into the shoes of the decision makers, so to speak, and be able to understand not only what's happening now, but to anticipate what's going to be in the news months or even years from now, right? And part of that is understanding what the current trend lines are. Part of that is having a very good understanding of what the supply chain components are, which of course, as a business, you're already going to be doing that, right? So whether it's energy supply, whether it's the supply of critical minerals, or whether it's the supply of the advanced components that Taiwan provides, the finished product, so to speak, and understand if something is going to be disrupted in one of those links of the supply chain, what are the options? What other countries can you turn to? What would be the time component? What would be the risk component? So these are things, again, trying to imagine what the future will actually be. We can't predict with certainty what's exactly going to happen, but we certainly can anticipate some trend lines and then prepare for those accordingly.
Yes, I agree. Simulation, forecasting, or all kinds of information is definitely necessary for today's, situation, especially for private sector. The next question I have for you is that Taiwan is now planning to collaborate with Alaska, the U.S., aiming to invade the U.S. LNG project. From your perspective, why is it strategically important for Taiwan to diversify its LNG source beyond Asia and Middle East? And why Taiwan has to work closely with the US at this moment?
Right. So, I mentioned before, if you look at the actual providers, the exporters of natural gas to Taiwan, some of those countries in the Middle East, and even Russia, which is both in Europe and Asia of sorts, could potentially not be the most reliable countries in the event of a crisis scenario. Obviously, right now things are kind of operating under more just kind of market conditions, but we've seen in the case of Ukraine, we've seen in the case of the wars in the Middle East, those can have direct impacts on energy flows. So for the U.S., I think that the importance is not only that it's another source of LNG in this case, but also that those connections could enhance Taiwan's security further in terms of linking it more closely with what has been one of the most important allies for Taiwan, along with the regional countries like Japan, Australia, and others. So it's not just about the functional element, which is very important for Taiwan, as we mentioned, the diversified sources of energy, but it's also the strategic component, what those energy sources and those partnerships will entail. I think this is a big part of the trade negotiations that we're seeing. For example, if you look at China, for example, has now basically cut off all LNG imports from the US. And then you have other countries, as they're negotiating with the US, countries like Indonesia, that are saying, we're willing to actually increase our imports, our energy imports. And that in turn, I think will have a more favorable position for these countries in terms of overall trade negotiations. So there's the very kind of direct, functional element of that, but there's also the strategic implications that are important for Taiwan to consider.
Yeah, I think you are correct. Well, we need to diversify the sources, but I guess for many allies of the U.S. now we have questions. As you know, the U.S. energy market and U.S. energy industry, we have different take from different political perspective, from Republican to Democrat. If Taiwan want to work with the U.S. or any Asian allies of the U.S. want to work with the U.S. To secure LNG supply from Alaska or from any other places, what should Taiwan or other Asian allies know about the U.S. Natural gas sector or energy sector, and how does this polarization of the U.S. politics may affect the energy policy, as we know from President Biden to President Trump? Do we have to put any attention on the policy consistency, or the energy supply will be very consistent, and the energy sector will, the policy toward energy sector will be very stable? What's your take on this, and what's your advice for Asian allies, including Taiwan, to deal with potential change or potential stable situation? Any suggestion?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think broadly speaking, energy is something that is bipartisan in nature in terms of support from both Republicans and Democrats. I think the area that has seen kind of more split along party lines is on the climate, change element, where about basically, the Biden administration placed a lot of emphasis on expanding, solar, wind, and renewable production, EVs, battery supply chains, things of that nature. This is an area where the Trump administration is obviously placing less emphasis, although a lot of that is private sector driven. So it doesn't mean that all stops, just because there's less immediate and direct government support for it. But if you're talking about fossil fuel production like natural gas, this is very much a bipartisan issue. We've seen, over the last decade, the U.S. has grown significantly as a producer and exporter of oil and natural gas in particular. And this is something that the Trump administration, and I believe future administrations, will continue to emphasize as a source of American growth and as a source of building relationships with other countries. So we've seen, for example, after or in the middle of the Ukraine conflict, that the U.S. was able to help Europe diversify from Russia by sending a lot of LNG to the European countries. Now, as we've already discussed, a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Indonesia, including Taiwan itself, has pinpointed this energy aspect as a source for growth, essentially, and for deepening those economic ties. So I think if you're in the place where you need to diversify, where you need to not just diversify, but enhance your energy security that has both, internal and external applications of it. I think it's very important, for Taiwan to really kind of play into that, because I think the benefits will be, as we've already talked about, not only in terms of its own energy supply, but having a stronger relationship with the US overall, one that I think will not just be prone to kind of partisan politics, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. Given the situation that energy is important, especially we're entering into the AI or high-tech world. We all know the computer chips and all the high-tech related industry need a lot of energy. So I'd like to follow up with this kind of a development. Given the geopolitical tension, under the situation that all the country focus on like AI technology. Particularly with the competition between the US and China, are there specific risk to Taiwan's energy supply, for the AI technology, or for any like Asian allies? Do they have to be very cautious about the US-China competition, and how this competition may impact, their preparation of the energy security? Any thought?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. This is definitely something to be conscious of. We've seen how this U.S. competition has obviously intensified in recent years, and especially over the last couple of months, and that it's played out in the supply chain of sorts, not just overall trade, but we're seeing, China selectively restrict critical minerals access, for example. This then, has really caused the U.S. to reevaluate its own supply chains. And so I think it's an instructive example here, as we're developing more and more of those capacities within the U.S., whether it's reshoring or friendshoring. I think it's important to look at major tech companies here in the U.S. like Microsoft and Google and others that are essentially recognizing how important it is to have direct access to energy sources in order to fuel their AI growth and their AI development. And that includes, by the way, very much nuclear power is on the rise here, where companies are basically sourcing from their own nuclear plants to ensure that steady supply of energy is there. So I think there's a lot to learn from there when it comes to Taiwan. The US, Taiwan unfortunately doesn't have the kind of benefits of being a major energy producer when it comes to natural gas and things of that nature. So it is reliant on imports, and that's why that diversification, especially with like-minded countries or friendly countries, is so important. But so is being able to rely on your own domestic resources, and this is where I think nuclear can fuel that expansion of AI, which would only enhance Taiwan's own economic position and its role within the global supply chains and with its allies as well.
Yes, well, I think, generally speaking, the global, geopolitical tension really bring a lot of questions for the whole world. And you just mentioned, I have this question for you. You just mentioned at your institution, you guys work a lot like on simulation and forecast. So from Taiwan's perspective, of course, people like to know, what the future looks like given this global tension. So can you give us a broad or general idea, what the simulation could help, Taiwan to see the future or to get itself prepared? I think it's probably very necessary for Taiwan to get more understanding and more idea how to prepare themselves in terms of not only in terms of the energy security, but general security preparation, or we can say comprehensive security strategy. Can this simulation or forecast help, or any kind of this type of simulation or preparation technology could help Taiwan or any other allies in Asia? So just give us some idea, why this matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, obviously there's a lot of simulations and war games that are done around the Taiwan, Strait crisis, so to speak. Whether here in Washington, D.C., where I am, or in Taiwan itself. But really what we focus on, and those are obviously very important to do, but what we focus on at New Lines is more of an examination of the intersection between those types of security dynamics, but also diplomatic, statecraft, and economic and supply chain implications. Because I think this is really, if we're looking in terms of forecasting, I think that hybrid dimension is really the key to our overall forecast for the Indo-Pacific and for China and Taiwan in particular. Meaning that hybrid in the sense of anything short of kind of kinetic, major military conflict is where I think the majority of that activity has been and will continue to be. So whether that's cyber warfare, whether that's manipulation of supply chains, and that, by the way, doesn't have to just be a full-scale blockade, because that in itself is essentially an act of war. I think China typically operates under those gray zone scenarios where it won't necessarily trigger the major reaction, whether that's out of the U.S. or other allied countries in the Indo-Pacific. So here it's really important to get an understanding of what are the types of things that can happen in terms of the disruption in a non kind of military context to Taiwan's supply chains. And of course, that very much entails what we've talked about, LNG and coal, both of which are very critical for Taiwan's electricity production, which in turn powers its semiconductor manufacturing, right? But also things like critical minerals and also the advanced, manufacturing and technology that countries like Japan, even as far away as the Netherlands, are plugged into that supply chain. So we can examine in very specific detail what would happen if different nodes of that supply chain were to be disrupted for whatever reason, whether that be geopolitical, weather, or otherwise. And then what can you actually do about it in those types of scenarios? So I think for Taiwan, it's really, really important to be able to understand what are the different types of things that can happen in order whether you're a political leader, a business leader, to have contingency plans in place that reflect realistic scenarios in the future.
Yes, I agree with you. In the past, well, a lot of business owners, they try to focus on trade, try to focus on business, but now under the current global, global tension, geopolitical tension, more and more people realize that they have to be aware of what's going on in terms of the tension, the political tension, and potentially national security tension. So, having a certain tool or certain measure to help them make their right decision, for the company or for the government is quite important. So I'd like to ask you, looking at Taiwan's broader energy security or energy strategy, we talk about nuclear LNG, renewable energy. How should Taiwan balance its source to build a truly resilient and flexible energy system in the face of geopolitical uncertainty like now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the key word that you use, Dennis, is balance, right? There's not a one size fits all strategy here. It's not about even, taking the example of the US, where I think it would definitely benefit right now Taiwan for both energy and broader strategic reasons to increase its ties, for example, with LNG imports with the US. But that's not going to solve all of its problems, right? I think it's having a number of different countries, ideally those that are more strategically aligned with you than others. So you can have a diversified mix of coal suppliers, of LNG suppliers, but also maximizing your own domestic potential. And you can do that, by the way, with the help of technology and investment potentially from countries that are very skilled in this, such as the US or our Indo-Pacific allies. So looking at nuclear power generation, looking at renewable energy, and looking at those different sources of fossil fuels that are, both close to home as much as possible and in line with Taiwan's own geopolitical alignments. I think mastering that balance and understanding that if you have, a disruption, having stockpiles of those fuels, beyond a very short-term timeline is very important. So I think it's being able to understand and have a plan for A, let's diversify as much as possible, and also B, what will happen, what is the plan if any of those elements of the supply chain are disrupted or compromised in any form.
Yes, well, I think this is great point for Taiwan to consider. One final questions we'd like to ask Eugene. We talk about diversity, diversify the resources. We talk about Taiwan's energy supply is basically relies upon other country. So in your perspective, what's the strengths of Taiwan that Taiwan can convince other countries continue work with Taiwan, even under different pressure or different situation, they're still willing to work with Taiwan?
Well, it's a great question. I believe Taiwan has many strengths, but if I had to kind of pinpoint its central strength, especially as now the global economy, we're moving towards advanced technology, AI, everything like that. Taiwan plays a critical role in that. You can't have AI development without the most advanced chips, and you can't have the most advanced chips without Taiwan. And so I think this is really, amongst a lot of other things, this is really where Taiwan has a unique role within the global system, whether it be for allies, adversaries, or anybody in between. There's been efforts to diversify, as I mentioned, some of those supply chains, including here in the U.S. But I think we're still years, if not decades, away from replacing Taiwan in terms of those capabilities. And I think that the U.S. does have an interest in maintaining those connections, as do all of those other countries, those partner countries throughout the Indo-Pacific. So if you want to keep up in this modern world, and whether you're the US or any of those other states, I think Taiwan is critical in order to do that, and a strong relationship between those countries is the underpinning between all of that.
Well, Eugene, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation with you, insightful, practical, and critical for Taiwan's future. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, with Taiwan's audience today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for Taiwan Talk. Well, let's have another conversation soon. Bye-bye.